Chris, thank you very much. So that concludes the opening statements on either side. Keep your questions coming. There's lots of them to go through already on Slido, and I'll also invite questions from the floor. For now, if you're contributing on the floor, just make it relating to the question that we're dealing with at the time. And I will also ask you for separate comments and questions from the floor as well to see how many people we can get round to give you a chance to contribute to the debate. The question at the top has been at the top pretty much throughout the debate. So we'll start with that. Tariq, would you accept that most exotic pets are not kept in appropriate conditions and the good examples are the exceptions?
No.
Would you like to expand on that?
I think there is an awful lot of bad keeping, and I think there is an awful lot of good keeping. I think that most vets in general practice probably see quite a skewed population of animals. I think that exotic animals that are kept well often don't become unwell and don't become diseased. And I also think that very good, dedicated exotic owners seek out exotic-specific vets. And so general practice vets don't get to see so many of those very good, dedicated owners. I think there are welfare issues which obviously I've already touched on and which I think we need to find solutions for. But no, I don't agree that the majority of exotic keeping is bad. I think there is a problem, but I don't think it's the majority.
Mark?
I would agree with the statement that I think the majority of exotic pets are probably not being kept in very high welfare conditions. I can't justify that by putting figures on it. Something interesting that Chris said is that actually I think there'd be a lot of agreement with a lot of what's being said across it. And of course, the question that you're being asked is quite a loaded question. Can we provide for the welfare of animals? Well, in some circumstances, for some species, in some conditions, then maybe we can, but in an awful lot of cases, we can't, and or we don't, or we, as this sort of type of specialist audience, shall we say, aren't in a position to control whether we do or not, because the keeping often isn't being done by us. Yeah, a couple of things I mentioned during the talk. Rarity and novelty can be quite significant drivers of demand, which compounds the constant problem that we're trying to catch up with our knowledge, in terms of our knowledge of animals' needs and animals' normal behaviour and animals' social and cultural and societal behaviour in the wild, which I think we're only really beginning to scratch the surface of in most cases. So, and I also think we need to think about what we mean and how we define appropriate conditions. And my own view is that if we're going to keep wild animals in captivity, we ought to be setting the bar extremely high.
Okay, anybody got a quick comment from the floor on that particular question? Yes, one or two. Lady on my right, your left.
Thank you. I'm Fika. I'm the president of the BVZS, the Geological Society. And I'm also a practicing zoo veterinarian. And I'm going to amalgamate all your stories and come to some consensus here on what we do or don't believe in. I particularly want to start with what Romain said, and says, yes, we can keep certain species within their welfare needs. Like the albatross, probably not, like Tariq said. But also, no, we probably don't, and quite a lot of it has to do with not knowing what the species requirements are. And I think this is where we as veterinarians have got a very important role to play. We are the profession that has actually sworn an oath to put nothing above the health and the welfare of the animals in our care. We need to be available to the public so that they trust to come with their animals to us. And if it's not within your remit of expertise, please direct them to those who have further studied these topics. Once we are there to look after their animal, we can also hopefully gain their trust. And this goes for both zoos and private individuals, so that we can then also steer them towards keeping the correct species, which is within their means, both financially and environmentally. There's also a lot of zoos that keep large animals in too small enclosures for that particular species.
Okay,
The zero grazing, species, for instance.
Thank you for that. We're broadening it out quite a bit. I just want to stick to that original question, if I may. We may well come back to some of those points. Thank you for making. Anybody else got a point specifically about the question that Tariq was asked, lady on the left-hand side?
Thank you. I'm Sonal from Wild Animal Protection. Tariq, you were very firm in saying no. And then you said that if you're not seeing them in your veterinary practice, that's probably because you're missing all these great examples where there hasn't been a problem. Now, are you trying to imply that at the point of a problem, which is when someone comes to a vet, that's the point at which the welfare needs are no longer being met? Because I would argue that that's the point that there's a problem.
No. No, I don't think that. And I think, as I say, there is a significant amount of bad keeping, and that's something we need to do something about. And it's not when the animal becomes ill, it's the husbandry leading up to that.
One more quick one for the gentleman at the back there with the... dare I say with the grey hair? I can say it because I've got grey hair, so it's fine.
As grey as yours, Nick. Tim Morris. I'd like to ask a more sort of concise version of the front one, the first question in this session, and it applies just as much to the session this morning and to the panellists. Bluntly, I know this is not the BVA, this is the BVA's Animal Welfare Foundation, but do vets need to up their game on this?
That's a much broader question. Look, can I come back to that? I'll make a note of that, and we won't let that go. Was yours specific about this first question?
Martin White, general practice, but exotics vet. You seem to think that because a lot of the vets, the animals that are kept well, don't come to the vet. Lots of the animals that are really ill and die don't come to vets. Talk to the exotic pet shops. That they're always being asked about these animals. I've spoken to my local exotic pet shops. A lot of the animals that are taken there because they're ill and dying, they never come and see me. I'm their local vet.
I don't disagree with you that there are welfare problems out there, and I think we need to do things in terms of regulation, education, etc., to improve things. But as well as an exotic vet, I'm also an exotic animal keeper, and I have been for several years. I go to exotic animal shows. I have lots of exotic animal keeping friends who actually keep their animals, I think, to a fairly high welfare standard. And I think there is plenty of good keeping out there as well. I maintain my position.
You mixed with the enthusiasts and the hobbyists. They're a very, very minority group of keepers.
I don't think they are.
Almost all the animals in the country, and you do know this, are corn snakes and bearded dragons and royal pythons. They're the common things. And they're kept by people who just keep one or two animals. They're not enthusiasts, they're not hobbyists, they don't know what they're doing, and that's where the problem is.
I don't necessarily agree. I partly agree with you. I think there are some very experienced keepers that keep bearded dragons and royal pythons and corn snakes. There are a lot of noobs. Everybody has to start somewhere, and we can talk about some of the ways that we could improve welfare for people that are beginners. Like, for example, looking at the people selling the animals and the advice they give and what research you need to do beforehand. But I agree with you. There's a lot of bad keeping as well.
Let me take the laser off Tariq just for a moment and go to that question highlighted at the top. Can keeping many of these species in captivity ever really be considered legal under the Animal Welfare Act? Should there be a list of unacceptable species for captivity? Romain.
So, this is a tricky one because I spent a lot of my life fighting welfare prosecutions and wildlife crime prosecutions. And there's always bits of legislation that don't work, and I'm always keen on more legislation, but there is always the unintended consequence, because this may be aimed at, say, exotic pets, and say, okay, fine, there was a question on polar bears, for example. So that's a really difficult animal to try and meet its needs in captivity. It doesn't mean you can't. So keeping a polar bear in a small outdoor exhibit in Mexico makes no sense. Of course, no one's saying it does. But a huge tract of land with animals that interact and we can obviously assess what's happening and adjust accordingly, I do think that is viable. So say, for example, we say, okay, you're not allowed to keep polar bears, or we're not allowed to keep bears. Fair enough. What about rewilding? Then there are people who want to transition bears from a very, very large captive enclosure, basically what some zoos like Yorkshire Wildlife Park, Highland Wildlife Park are doing with polar bears, and transition these to a wild state, which we then accept is fantastic for these animals. It's a very grey line. Is there a very big difference from these very big enclosures to a sort of a semi-wild enclosure? So we always presume everything's better in the wild, but it isn't necessarily. The planet's pretty messed up, and many of us spend our days patching up animals that are peeled or fenders and have all sorts of interactions, and mangy foxes running around in an urban setting. That's a wild animal. It's having a dreadful life. We're trying to find a pragmatic, practical way to address very big questions, but in a way that protects the welfare of the individual. So legislation can be a blunt tool, and I do think that we probably should have a list, but it's very difficult to assess how we do this without having all sorts of unintended consequences that can have other detrimental effects.
Chris Draper, and then some comments from the floor on that.
I think it's a very interesting question that perhaps I'm going to suggest we look at through the other end of the telescope, where actually, rather than having a list of species we shouldn't keep, maybe we should be looking at a list of species we can keep, and basically assume through sort of applying the precautionary principle that there's going to be compromise in keeping wild animals in captivity unless proven otherwise. And I think if we started to adopt that approach, whether it's legally possible, I don't know, I think that would be a very good starting point, and we come up with what people are referring to as a positive list of animals that have been kept in sufficient number for long enough time, and the science is in and the evidence is in that their welfare needs in the general way of doing things, that it's okay to keep them. I think that might be a way to approach this problem.
Putting my journalist's hat on, have you not just answered the question for the other side? Is it possible to meet, we can meet the needs of exotic animals?
I didn't say there were any species that met that category.
You rather implied there might be. Some comments from the floor. Now there is a lady in the third row there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for some really stimulating and very interesting debate. I'm Tariq from London Zoo, and I'd like to just take Chris's point. I completely agree, and I was actually going to put that question, should we have a list of species we can keep? But then I'm thinking of some of the species that, obviously because they're the ones I work with, but that can be kept, that you know nothing about, but that we have the only ones that are left. They are extinct in the wild, and they've come in, and are kept, and these can be very small. They can be invertebrates, they can be species that no one even knows about, but if we hadn't taken them in and started to work on some guidelines and developed those guidelines and are now able to keep them, propagate them, and now reintroduce them back into the wild, we wouldn't have been able to do that if there's actually a list. So there's a caveat to that as well.
Romain?
Yeah, so I would agree. So there was an intentional slide with the snail, and I didn't explain that. So that was the very last individual of that species on the entire planet. So it was a parched snail that came from Polynesia. There's a really interesting story if you want to go and read up on them. We managed to take a single individual, because these are hermaphrodites that have already been fertilized, get it to give us young, and it's gone back to the wild. So we have now released about 2,000 of these back in Polynesia. So I agree completely with what Ty says, and sometimes these messages are lost. That does not mean that we must not think about that individual, whether it is a snail or orangutan, and it's very easy to focus on elephants from both sides and defend things, but I would also agree with what Born Free quite commonly say, is that there is a compassionate way to do conservation. It can get very, very hard-nosed where welfare doesn't get a look in with conservation things, and we have to think what we're really trying to achieve. We're not going to go back to some sort of pristine, doughy-eyed vision where there's no people and everything's a beautiful rainforest and there's giant ground sloths in North America. Those days are gone, okay? There's never going to be that situation. Okay. We have to find a way to make this work in the planet that we live in now.
Going right to the top for the next comment. Chris Lawrence.
Aren't we missing the basic underlying point here? And that is that dogs and cats and most of the small mammals that we keep have been domesticated for many thousands of generations and selected to live with humans in the way that humans keep them. And that wild animals have not been adapted in any way like that. And therefore, we cannot provide their normal environment.
Everyone's looking at Tariq.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think actually, if you look at a species like a bearded dragon, so a bearded dragon is from Australia. Australia hasn't allowed the export of its wildlife since the 1960s. So most bearded dragons in the UK now have been here 50, 60 years. And in that time, there have been lots and lots of generations, lots of selective breeding. If you look at a bearded dragon now, very often it bears no resemblance to a wild-type bearded dragon. If you look at the latest hypo-translucent leatherback German giant bearded dragon, it's so grotesquely different, I would almost argue that they have become domesticated, and yet they're still considered to be exotics. And they have evolved in a way to cope with captivity over all of those years. So I think it's an interesting point, but I think some species probably are starting to become domestic animals.
Chris Draper.
Just if I may just pick up on that point, I think it's very interesting that I think Chris has hit on the absolute nub of the debate, and we've selected through a process of domestication with the traditional species that we're familiar with, dogs, cats, etc., for animals that cope not just physically but behaviourally with what we have them alongside us doing. I don't think that is comparable with selection for colour morphs that don't come with any, there's potentially no change in the bearded dragon's behaviour. There might be some change in their what they look like.
I disagree with you.
Okay, that might be just co-selection, but we're not selecting for.
No, I think we're selecting for animals which have a better feeding response, which are more resilient to disease, which cope better with.
By virtue, how are we? Is there an actual program of selection for those behaviours, or is that an accidental byproduct of the fact that only those animals that can cope with captivity end up breeding? That's a slightly different thing. So an active selection and domestication process over millennia, which is what we'd be talking about with dogs and cats.
So I think there has been some active selection for lizards which are more robust and which cope with captivity better. But I take your point. A lot of these species, an African grey parrot is a wild animal. And it's probably only, if you look at some Amazon parrots, they're probably only 2 generations captive bred. And I think it's a case of, I think part of it is you've got to consider the end user, and we've got to make a distinction here between the complete noobs, little Johnny off the street who goes in with his mum and dad to his local reptile shop and wants to buy a Yemen chameleon, or somebody who has a degree in zoology and who's kept chameleons for 10 years and knows exactly what they're doing and has read 10 volumes of keeping chameleons in captivity and is an expert in their field. And I think the wilder species, probably in a lot of cases, are not good domestic pets, but they may be appropriate for the serious enthusiasts. And I don't think it's right for us to penalise those serious people who look after those species well.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Chris, for the question. I'm going to go back to my friend with the much better shock of grey hair than I have and actually convert it into Laura's question, because it's essentially the same, covering the same ground at the top of the screen now. Do you feel there should be more training for exotic species during vet nurse training due to their increasing popularity as captive pets, or as my grey-haired friend put it, should vets up their game? Who wants to start? Romain, you're nearest. Bad luck.
I do think we should up our game in that we need to engage more with these situations. And I mean, there are some veterinarians that have gone much more into directorships and handoff roles. We are somewhat sometimes disempowered in the role that we're playing in these situations as advisors or employees. That can be really difficult. I think it's a very difficult thing to emphasize more training because the veterinary curriculum is incredibly crowded, and this is yet another, I won't say a niche branch, but it's yet something else. So we cannot know everything about everything. I'm no longer up to date with exotic pets. I wouldn't be happy seeing one. In theory, I'm seeing similar species or the same species in a different setting, but there's a big difference in how we will try and address those problems. So I don't think we need to do more training. We give a good grounding to our graduates in making them as broadly applicable to the marketplace, and then that's up to you as a veterinarian to decide your role and go and continue your education and develop and foster those skills that you need to deal with what you do. Forcing someone who intends to be an equine surgeon to learn more about zoo animals is counterproductive. They'd be best getting a good grounding in concepts, the basic information they need, and then I'm afraid it needs to be postgraduate.
Mark, more training or not?
I find myself a bit conflicted by this question in a sense, in that if an animal turns up, if an owner brings an animal into a veterinary surgery and the animal clearly requires some form of veterinary intervention in order to improve its health, we would all hope that that intervention may be available to that animal so that the health of that particular animal can be improved. But I think Fika made the point about animals under my care or in my care. I should know that, shouldn't I? The veterinary oath. It's a long time since I took it. But in providing services to an industry, if you like, that's resulting in people obtaining exotic pets, we are in danger of kind of perpetuating the industry, perpetuating the opinion among many people who keep animals. We've been discussing whether they can keep them, provide them with adequate housing and welfare or not. But nevertheless, they keep these animals, and you're kind of providing them with the impression that this is acceptable because the services and so forth become available to them in order to perpetuate their keeping. So I do find myself a little bit conflicted, but I do agree that it would be impossible to introduce effective education through the veterinary curriculum for the kind of range of species we've been talking about here. And again, I come back to the fact that the range of species is enormous, and we can't get away from the fact that for that animal that appears in your surgery that's owned by someone, many other animals through the supply chain that's resulted in that animal being there may have suffered and died, and the mortality rates of some of these species through the supply chain can be absolutely enormous. So I think we have to think about it. It's a difficult one. I think we have to think carefully about the kind of advice and the kind of motivation that we might be giving to the general public in their desire to own these exotic animals.
Okay, I'm sure there will be comments from the floor on this, particularly
if I
people.
Just respond to him because he was talking about my comment.
Yes,
if
please
I may.
do. Please do.
So, Fika again from the BVZS, Mark. So I completely disagree with you that by saying that you provide a service, you feed into the market. These animals are there, they are being kept, and they should have adequate service of someone trying to improve their welfare. And that's what I meant with animals under our care. If we see this particular species, we need to give them expert care that is particular for that species, and that also gives us the opportunity to improve this animal's welfare. This is going to be kept whether you like it or not, probably, and steer people away from species that are even more difficult to keep, potentially. So I do not believe that by providing a specialized veterinary service, you make them keep those species even more. That we should be there for these animals because they will be kept, unfortunately, in some cases.
And I do agree with that. And I did make the point that everybody would want that animal that's presented to the surgery to receive good veterinary care. So I agree with you. But what I'm saying is, alongside that, we have to be careful that the information that we're giving to people in the wider public as a profession doesn't encourage the keeping of animals where we can't provide adequately for their welfare, where owners can't provide adequately for their welfare.
Okay, a couple more quick thoughts on this, and then I'll move on to something else.
Just by dialogue, you have more influence.
Okay. Lady there, and then one at the back, and then we'll move on.
Caroline Allen, I'm the Chief Vet for the RSPCA. And firstly, I wanted to thank Chris for the comment he made about, the rescuing of these animals. And what we've just heard from the panel is, that this is very niche, very specialist. So I wanted the panel's thoughts really on what sort of rescue, rehabilitation and approach to mistreatment of these animals looks like, given that the organisations are predominantly set up for the more commonly sort of known species. But we're facing massive challenges. One site, a dumped African wildcat, boa constrictors every week dumped in the park, corn snakes, chameleons. It's a big challenge.
Thank you. At the back.
Hi, this is a question a little bit out of ignorance, but being a farm vet, but presumably if you get people who come into your practice, and I agree that we should, try and look after animals under our care, obviously, no matter what the species, But if somebody walks into the practice and clearly isn't capable of looking after the animal, is there some kind of, within the legislation or within our professional ethics, a duty to actually cease that person's ownership, keepering, or whatever you guys call it, in some way? And if you do that, what happens to the animal? Does it necessarily get put down and that's its life ended, or how does that all work? I think
can I have an answer from the... Who on the floor can answer that? Because I'm sure there's any amount of...
Shall we ask our CVS president?
Expertise. Why not?
Sorry, Amanda.
So Amanda Berg, our CVS president. So, I mean, as the veterinary regulator, we would expect any veterinary surgeon to be able to provide basic emergency first aid care to whatever species is in front of them. Realistically, and not to put too fine a point on it, that can be euthanasia. And for some of these exotic species, and with my other hat on, I'm an emergency vet, so we end up seeing these unusual species in the middle of the night when we don't have, we don't necessarily have, we're dog and cat vets normally. And that would be the expectation. We don't, as far as I know, have a right to remove, we have a right to end an animal's life if we feel that its welfare is so compromised and can do that. I would always suggest that you get another veterinary surgeon to confirm that point of view before you take that step. But I don't think we have a right to impound animals, so to speak. And I think that would, you say, raise a whole lot of other questions then about what happens to those animals.
Thank you. Amanda, quickly, Romain.
Just a quick point that I wanted to bring up for the rescue of these animals. So I do a lot of rehab, and I euthanize about 70% of every animal that moves through my hand. So I think if we can't move these animals into a high welfare situation, they come through rescue, we euthanize them. It's not a welfare compromise. Just like Polly said this morning, we're not trying to save everything. We're trying to keep them well. And if we can't, then we euthanize them.
I know I said I'd move on. I'll take two more. There's a lady here very, very keen to join in. And then, is it Ben? Yeah, okay.
Just to make a point on the seizing of animals, because I think it is quite an important one, that actually, I mean, there is a process by which animals can be seized if, they're suffering and their welfare is compromised, and that is through getting a police officer involved, signing Section 18 certificate, Section 18.3 if you believe that animal needs to be euthanized. So there is a legal process, and the vet is absolutely at the centre of that, and I think that's really important for vets to know and understand. And obviously, you can involve the RSPCA in that as well, because if the animal's not euthanized and, the animal is then seized, it does have to go to a court case for that animal to be kept permanently from that owner. But I'm happy to discuss it in more detail in the break.
Thank you very much for that. I know I said I'd move on, but since it's due to Ben Mays that I'm sitting in this chair at all, I feel obliged to take his question or comment. Ben.
Nick, that's very kind. Ben Mays, I'm a welfare trustee. Just in point of the training of veterinarians, I mean, it is our job as general practitioners to deliver welfare and to signpost in the respect if we don't have the knowledge about exotics. There was a question earlier at the bottom of the page about leaflets from the AWF, and we did in our last trustees meeting spend a long time, because we know the curriculum is crowded, how can we help young vets in terms of exotics? And we discussed at length supplying every final year vet student with the BSAVA Exotic Pet Manual. I just wondered what the panel felt about this.
A few quick thoughts?
Can I come in quickly? Yeah. So I think that vets in practice should not be working up exotic cases, should not be doing complex things with exotics. I don't think the training is there in the curriculum. I think the curriculum is too crowded to add it in. I think that vets in practice need to know how to give first aid and emergency treatment, and there is an issue there. The most common advice inquiry that I get as an exotic vet is, how do I euthanize this, or what pain relief should I give this? And I think if the veterinary curriculum was rejigged a bit and condensed so that that useful practical information was given, that would be for the best. And then I think they should go and see an exotic vet. And there are exotic vets all over the United Kingdom. The BVZS maintains a list. There will be an exotic vet within an hour or two of most places in the UK, and I think that's the approach that we should take, really.
Chris, Mark, anything to add, or shall I move on?
Just a quick point, and it's a more general comment, that if we're looking at, I mean, I totally agree with the points about euthanasia as a very valuable tool for animals' welfare, but if it gets away from the point I was keen to make, that if we're looking at simple survival and the need to euthanize as a metric of welfare, then I think we're not looking at the whole picture. We need to be ensuring provision of good welfare for animals, not just looking at when and if and when we end their life.
Okay. Thank you, Anonymous, for the highlighted question. How do you weigh up the value of something like freedom for an animal against physical health and comfort? Mark Jones.
Goodness. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think our knowledge of animal welfare requirements for different species, and and I include in that, and I've mentioned it before, their sort of cultural and societal requirements. If they're social animals, their need for contact with other conspecifics and societal structures with other conspecifics in which they sit is in some cases growing, but it's still pretty limited for many of the species that we're talking about here. We have moved from kind of the 5 freedoms to the 5 domains model, which we talked about before, which does sort of bring us into the whole issues of behavioural and sort of mental or health of animals, which I think is really important. But it's very, very difficult to say that, in very general terms, whether, I forget what the exact wording of the question now because it's displayed off the screen, but whether health, physical health and comfort should be considered more important than freedom, whatever freedom might mean.
That was the wording of the question.
I
took a photo of it before it disappeared from the screen.
So it's hard to put some kind of value judgment on that because it's going to be so dependent on the particular circumstances.
I mean, there are some very good matrices, and this is always a problem with zoo animals, is that we're trying to improve whatever system you're in, is the monitoring of what's effective. But I know Sarah Wolfenson's report on the Animal Welfare Assessment Grid. You could use a simple tool like that as an assessment to try and say, okay, this is going to be what we expect the animal to do in the wild and what it currently would be in captivity, and compare the two, because it can be used to compare things over time, but it can be used for that individual, not between individuals, to make an assessment. So we can sometimes bring our emotions to things, and this is obviously a danger, is that we have an opinion, then we look for science, and I don't like zoos, so this is evidence against the zoo, or I do like zoos, so this is evidence for. We're vets, we're scientists, we should be above that. If the evidence develops in 10 years, and they're right, we shouldn't have zoos, then I'm going to change my opinion. That's what science is about. It's not about choosing stuff that suits our position. It's making our position based on evidence. Maybe we'll show progress in the other direction. Who knows? But I think we have to keep an open mind rather than going from an ethical and belief system and then looking for justification from science. We should be trying to base our belief system on the available evidence, and that's going to constantly change.
Thank you. I'm going to defy convention, IT people. Sorry, I'm going to go to question number 4, which isn't on your screen. Maybe you can highlight it. I'll read it out anyway. Much of what has been mentioned today is related to a lack of understanding amongst lay people. Surely we need more education about animal welfare at school. Chris?
I think a simple yes is a good answer to that one. I mean, it's something that would be enormously beneficial across so many levels, in my opinion. How it would be delivered, I don't have the answers on that, but I have no doubt there are organisations well placed to work that into various aspects of the curriculum. It baffles me that there isn't at least basic education or introductory education about animal welfare. To my understanding, there isn't currently.
Any thoughts on the floor on that after Romain?
So in Scotland, we don't have the RSPCA, we've got the Scottish SPCA. We've got a penetration of almost 50% of all school children that get a visit at least once during their curriculum on animal welfare. So we're a small country up there, and we get forgotten about, and we have different processes and legislation, but it can work. So obviously scaling this down to the whole of the rest of the UK can be problematic, but it is possible, and there has been some research to show that has reduced young offences in animal welfare. So it works if you do it, and you need to do it, and making it practical is obviously the logistical difficulty.
No hands up on the floor. So here's another. Oh, there is one hand. Sorry, on the end of the row. Fling the microphone across. I dare you.
Maja Cygańska, student from Poland. Sorry, is there a reason why we're not talking about the first question that's up on the screen right now?
I was just about to ask it had you not put your hand up. That was the second half of my sentence. Do you agree that it's vital holidaymakers are educated about bad welfare standards of some exotic animal attractions abroad in order to stop these practices? Did you want to contribute on that? With the microphone. We'll ask the panel first, and then I'll come to you. Who wants to speak on the panel? Chris.
Sorry, I'm mid pouring water.
You can multitask.
It's to say I can't. I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely, 100%. It's vital that we educate holidaymakers, and it's something that Born Free is working on very hard at the moment. Not just educating individual holidaymakers to alert us to what they see, but to make their voices heard to the relevant authorities that in the country in which they might be going. There's also a really important part to be played in this by tour operators and travel industry companies who are, in some cases, accidentally enabling tourists to encounter poor animal welfare. In some cases, I think, turning very much a blind eye to genuinely controversial and quite poor animal welfare. So I think it's something that will be led by the consumers spending in the long run. We also have to bear in mind that it'll be a slow process, because obviously we can educate, let's say, Western Europe, North America. The problem might shift to different parts of the world with different constituencies of holidaymaker who will then also need to go on that same journey that perhaps we're going on in the West. But it's a big issue.
Madam, thought from the floor?
Thank you very much. As a vet student, I still don't really have a lot of ideas, so that was more of a question to the board.
Okay, thank you. Any more thoughts on that from the floor before I move on? Okay. This one has been hovering near the top throughout the afternoon. Considering overtreatment from this morning, are we as a profession just facilitating long-term conditions and suffering of exotics not suited to life as pets? Tariq.
I think the overtreatment presentation this morning was incredibly interesting, and I think that applies to exotic animal medicine as it does to small animal medicine. I think if you get a Harris hawk with a fractured tibia tarsus and you put a couple of pins in it and 3 weeks later it's fixed, brilliant. I think if you've got to do something extremely invasive, if you've got to do chemotherapy on an exotic, I think there are questions that we should ask in terms of how far do we go. So I think it is a really important issue, and it's relevant to exotics as it is small animals.
Chris, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that we need to be very conscious of the possibility of prolonging suffering, perhaps in some circumstances by prolonging life in very poor welfare conditions. So I think that's something as a profession we need to be very conscious of. And somebody earlier mentioned, when we were talking about the need for greater veterinary education, the impossibility of educating veterinarians through the and other veterinary professionals through the current curriculum with the huge range of species that we have. But certainly ensuring that people coming out have a very clear idea that about this particular issue, and about the fact that you don't want to be, looking at a situation where life is being perpetuated but with the result that suffering is extended. And I think, the much larger issue, perhaps, of public education needs to try and address that issue as well.
Before I move on to the next question, there's a lady at the front here. If we get a microphone to her. Thank you very much.
Hello, just want to thank you for all your talks. Just now we discussed about the veterinary education, and we talked about how it's difficult already to incorporate exotics teaching. How can we even expect the public to understand this aspect, or how can we even incorporate into public education? What strategy, or are there any thoughts about how we can do it? Yeah, just wondering.
Romain?
Yeah, so I think this is I'm glad you brought that up because it's a really important point in that everyone in this room has an opinion on everything. Brexit, keeping animals in zoos, whether my wife is crazy for having married me. The problem is they're not always informed opinions, okay? So, I'm not talking about my wife now, she'll probably hear this. But, so, the problem is providing the information to people make opinions. I have no problem with different opinions, as long as they're informed. So it is not our role to give our ethical framework and beliefs to the public. That's not our role. Our role is to guide them to be able to make reasonable, opinionated decisions based on evidence. And that's what's failing at the moment. Is you go on YouTube and you'll see people selling, I mean, there's incredible welfare disasters that people are selling live mechanisms to shove a hook down through a fish so it stays alive, so it wiggles on there so you can fish with it because it's better than, you know, some sort of whirligig to catch fish. I mean, there's crazy stuff out there and there's brilliant stuff out there and there's no differentiation. So this is a problem across veterinary, this is a problem across animals in general. How we solve that is a very big professional debate. I think it's not just limited to this aspect. We need the public to have good quality information. There are good websites. BVA puts great stuff out. We need to get them directed to the information and they can make their own opinions.
Thank you. Yes, madam.
Hi there, I'm Katrina Prince. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist and a practitioner. I can see the flashing red light, so I'll be brief. You mentioned about evidence. Now, I'm quite interested that whilst there have been lots of numbers about numbers of animals, exotic animals in captivity, we're not seeing the percentages that potentially have poor welfare or their needs aren't being met. So, for instance, it wouldn't matter if, unless you're a purist, it wouldn't matter if every household in the UK kept an African grey parrot if their welfare needs were being fully met. So I'm wondering, how do we get that information? Do you have any estimates? It would be really interesting to know. Thank you.
So, I mean, there has been some work, and I'll say the pros and cons, and Martin will shout at me and beat me up over coffee. So British Veterinary Zoological Society and VC and them can say, have tried to address this, and it's a very complex task to get the information out there. And so the first step has been to obviously ask veterinarians for their opinion on, you know, are these animals being kept well? Do you think they're suffering? The problem is that that's a surrogate, like statins, looking at markers, not looking at what you're actually measuring. So we could come to a completely crazy decision. If we all go to the pub and have a drink and get drunk, and I ask you, do you think pigs can fly? And 70% of us say yes. It doesn't mean pigs fly, it just means we're idiots. So we have to measure what we really want to know. And I mean, we're battling as it is to make simple tools work sometimes in dogs and cats, and to have a good assessment of the quality of life that, you know, Polly's brought up for individual cases or for specific situations. We then need to apply this to exotic animals, and then you need to scale this to get a snapshot of what's going out there. So it's a big task, and I think British Veterinary Zoological Society is on a great first step. But I don't want to be devil's advocate, but you have to be very cautious on our opinions, because they may be rubbish. They may be fantastic, but they may be rubbish. So it's a surrogate and it's progress, but we still need the data. No one's really collecting that yet.
Mark, do you want to chip in? Briefly?
I agree with an awful lot of what's just been said. This is a highly complex issue, but I suppose I really come back to the points about education. We don't want to be in a situation where animals are being kept where their welfare is being compromised, and in order to avoid that, we need to have a great deal more effort put into systems of evaluating the welfare needs of some of these animals, and systems to ensure that people are well informed about the choices they subsequently make wherever possible, instead of those choices being made on a whim, or because something looks exciting, or because it looks exotic, or because it's appeared on a TV program somewhere. I think a great deal more public information education is required.
Okay, the red lights are flashing. I can't deny, lady, just been past the microphone. That'd be very rude. I will be fairly brutal with your 60 seconds summing up when we get there, which is coming next. So, final contribution from the floor, madam.
I think we've got to be very careful about saying we just need evidence, because there's too much information. And you can say to an owner, if you give it this treatment, it's got a 5% chance of surviving next week. And if you give it this treatment, it's got 10% chance of surviving until next month. We have got to help interpreting. Isn't that what our training is about?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask all four to sum up in 1 minute. I have my stopwatch. It's not a stopwatch, it's just my watch. And then you get a chance to vote again and see if it's still exactly 3-1 as it was. I'm going to remind you that the wording of the motion was, it is possible to meet the welfare needs of exotic animals in captivity. We'll reverse the order. 1 minute each. Chris Draper.
Okay. The summary of what I would like to say is actually prompted by the last question. There's an enormous amount we don't know about the animals that we already keep. There's an enormous amount we don't know about how we should be trying to meet their welfare needs. And even in those species that are commonly kept and widely kept, that knowledge is either unvalidated or not being applied or being applied in a hugely variable way. In tandem with that, we need to incorporate serious consideration of good or positive welfare within our assessment of whether animals' welfare needs are being met, rather than just looking at very basic avoidance of negatives. And my strong recommendation would be to adopt the precautionary principle wherever possible, that if we don't know what we're doing, we shouldn't be keeping these animals.
Thank you.
And I think that's the case across the board.
Mark Jones.
I'd agree with everything he said.
Thank you.
But also, I'd reiterate that our concern for the welfare of every animal that's presented to us in the surgery or that we visit in a zoo or whatever has to extend not just to that animal, but we have to bear in mind the consequences for all the other animals along the supply chain that's led to that point, whose welfare may have been compromised. And I go back to what I said at the end of my talk. I would argue that we're currently failing to meet the needs of a high proportion of animals in or affected by trade to supply exotic animal markets, live animal markets, if you like. And I argue that certainly for many species, we may never be able to do that.
Thank you. Tariq Ebuzar.
Can we meet their welfare needs? Yes, we can. Not always, but we can. We need to be more specific. We need to look at parrots and lizards and tortoises. We need to work out what the issues are, and we need to address them. We need campaigns, we need education, we need funding. We need to work with the keeping sector as a veterinary profession to try and improve things. But yes, we can.
Thank you. Romain.
Yes, I would stick to the is it possible? So not do we always do it? Of course not. And is it easy? Of course not. Nothing worthwhile is. So in many cases, I do think it is possible, but it's important to not forget the individual in this. It's very easy to do that study, look at polar bears in general, but this polar bear may not cope with what other polar bears do, or it may cope very well. And so while we're having these big, almost ethical debates about welfare, we also have to remember the individual. So I do think it is possible. And I think we need to remember the implications if we decide it's not possible, that we become disengaged as veterinarians from what will happen and we are unable to further improve these animals' lives.
Thank you very much indeed. Before we vote, a round of applause for the contributions for all the panellists. Thank you very much indeed. So here is your chance to show whether anything has changed in your opinion as a result of what you've heard. I remind you that the exact wording is at the top of your screen there. It is possible to meet the welfare needs of exotic animals in captivity. Agree or disagree? We'll see how the numbers stack up. Well, it's certainly moved quite a lot. You can carry on voting if you haven't done so yet, but 57-43 is a big, in debate terms, it's a big change from 75-25, which means at the very least, and it all went dark, there we are, we're back. It means at the very least that it's been a stimulating debate and you've been listening. Either that or you've just blindly pressed anything, but I don't believe that for a moment. I found it very educational. I hope we've all learned something. Just as a final illustration of the scale of the situation it'll only be in domestic pets. Just going to have a quick show of hands of those of you who are connected with in any way general practice as vets. Yeah, good, lots of you. Okay, how many of you see more than 20 exotic, or have visits more than 20 times a year from exotic pets? Okay, so that's about 20. Of you, how many of you notice a definite increase? Only one, okay. Two, sorry. So maybe it's not increasing as much as we thought, but it's a very unscientific survey. Thank you all very much indeed. A coffee break, I don't think looms is the word. Coffee break awaits, and if you come back for 4:25 for the next session, please. Thank you very much indeed.